Good morning and welcome everyone. Today we will have our last lecture on the ancients and we'll start to discuss Aristotle's politics. And Aristotle is the successor of Plato. So Aristotle was not just a competent political philosopher, but treated with many different fields of philosophy. To the extent that Thomas Aquinas, whom you might know, actually in his works just referred to Aristotle as the philosopher. So let's start with some introductory comments on the text itself. As you will have noticed, the text that we have read from Aristotle is structured completely different from Plato's Republic. The difference can be explained with regards to the metaphysical position of both authors, as well as their intended audience. For Plato, as you might remember, to be excellent in the art of government requires you to have a, a concept of the idea of the good. So it requires theoretical knowledge that is only attained through philosophers. So the aim or audience for Plato's Republic is to recruit or be read by philosophers. Aristotle thinks that in some way we can have direct access, in opposition to Plato, to the truth. We can therefore gain knowledge by closely observing and studying the world around us. If you take this metaphysical position when it comes to politics, it is worth to observe and study the political institutions and constitutions which you find around you. So this is also why Aristotle, over the span of his life, collected and studied over 150 different kinds of constitutions to compare them. And he also, as you might have noticed in the book, takes stock of opinions which are had in society and then puts them into discussion with each other to derive what he thinks is the most sensible claim. So you already see that there's a different approach to how to study politics between these two authors. On top of that, Aristotle was of the opinion that to be a good politician, you didn't require, as Plato said, theoretical knowledge, but rather you needed to have the idea of practical knowledge. So remember the discussion we had about Plato and whether the politician or the philosopher which he would have rule was practical enough in order to rule the city-state properly. Aristotle kind of in some way takes up this critique and says that it's practical knowledge which helps you to live better in the world. That is what a politician should have. So the aim of his book is therefore to give advice to statesmen rather than philosophers about how to best run their state. So he was educating a class of political elite or political rulers rather than addressing philosophers with his work. So in turn, this might make it a bit difficult to understand Aristotle, as within the span of a couple of pages you will find criticisms and appraisals of democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, as he had some advice to give to each respective ruler. So, what really is the politics of Aristotle's politics? This is definitely not an easy question to answer. He has been interpreted in many different ways. So, for instance, Thomas Hobbes is one of the main critics, which we'll read of. So we'll read them later on in the course, which we'll read of Aristotle. He, in chapter 46 of his Leviathan, writes, "I believe that scarce anything can be more repugnant to government than much of what Aristotle has said in his Politics, no more ignorantly in his Ethics." So we find here a strong critique of Aristotle. But why is Hobbes so negative about him? Well, Hobbes reads Aristotle as advocating for the generous doctrine of republican government, which for Hobbes, of course, relates to the Cromwellian period in England, which makes his claim or Thomas Hobbes' idea along the lines of that man is political results in genocide. But there are different interpretations of Aristotle by well-known philosophers. For instance, Aquinas, whom we mentioned briefly in the beginning, sees Aristotle as a defender of monarchy. Or Dante, he interprets Aristotle's writings as a defense of universal kingship under the leadership of a Christian prince. But there are also democratic thinkers who agree with Hobbes and see a defense of a form of democratic republicanism in Aristotle's writings. Most notably, Alexander Tocqueville and Hannah Arendt are amongst these interpreters of Aristotle. So, if there is such a wide interpretation possible of Aristotle, where should we start with beginning Aristotle's politics? Well, before we delve into the title of this task, which is Aristotle and Constitutions, I think it's good to have a look at what Aristotle considers to be the nature of politics. And to start to develop this idea, it might be good to have a look at his famous claim that man is by nature a political animal, and how this should be understood. You might be tempted to interpret this claim as a social biological account of men and why they live together in groups and how these groups then naturally evolve into larger entities resulting in the state, in which then politics would be like or engaging in politics would be like an inclination or something that happens spontaneous or impulsive. Yet this interpretation must be rejected. So how should we understand Aristotle then? Aristotle says, and I quote here directly, "Nature, according to our theory, makes nothing in vain, and man alone, of the animals, is furnished with the faculty of language, in which language is translated from the Greek word logos, which does not only mean language or speech, but also means reason." So, what does he mean with, to build up his account, we have to understand this, what does he mean with our theory says that nature makes nothing in vain? So the theory which he refers to is the claim that everything has the end of purpose. So a philos is the Greek word that should be used for this. And the philos of mankind is basically eudaimonia, which is a kind of happiness which is active and requires a continuous exercise of virtue. So, what is a philos is not something that's innate, but something that you need to work for and should achieve. So without this, man is either beast or God. So since we have logos, and the philos of logos is politics, he claims, or engaging into political conversation, in order to require this, or this is how we should understand Aristotle's claim that man is political. It's by an exercise of this faculty for speech, logos, that makes us political, because this allows us to engage into deliberation. So from this idea of then how man is political, or naturally political, we can develop an idea in which the city itself is natural. And for this purpose, we might want to look at another section from which I'll quote, in which he says this, referring to the city, may be said to have reached the height of its full self-sufficiency. Or rather, we may say that while it comes into existence for the sake of mere life, it exists for the sake of the good life. Thus, the city exists because we want to care about our ever bigger needs and become more self-sufficient. But in that, the city has reached a amount or reached a size that is big enough for us to engage actually into politics and not just be occupied with the mere preservation of the body, which would be gathering food, having shelter, and accumulating wealth. From this passage, we should also be able to understand, and I want you to think about this, why Aristotle claims that the city is prior towards the parts which it constitutes, even though obviously in the chronology he describes, right, of the marriage and then the household, the village, the city is temporally speaking the last one of these unions. So what then makes up a city? Since it's not just there for mere life. So a city is not just characterized by a shared locality or a shared commerce, but it's sharing in it's taking part in or sharing into the discussion about what justice is, and engaging in these deliberative and judicial processes which makes up politics. We can also see this reflected in the definition of citizenship, which Aristotle gives us. I will put all the quotes in the comments below, but the definition, or one of the definitions that Aristotle gives us, is the citizen is in this sense best defined by one criteria, and that is that he shares in the administration of justice and in the holding of offices. So the city is there by allowing noble actions, holding offices, to be taken by its citizens. So to participate in the good life and not just for the sake of living together. It's important to explore this notion of citizenship a bit further. It is interesting to look at Aristotle's critique of Plato's Republic in this regard. And then, in particular, one of the criticisms which he has on the holding of children and women in common. And he says the following: what is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care. People pay most attention to what is their own. They care less for what is common. People are more prone to neglect the duty when they think that another one is attending to this. This is what happens in the domestic service, where many attendants are sometimes less of an assistance than a few. So the idea here seems to be that what is held in common is neglected in common. And do you agree with this line of reasoning? Do you think that from this axiom we would be able to explain things like the bystander effect, for instance? But even though this passage mostly reads as a practical line of reasoning, so about how to achieve the best care practically, there is also a theoretical claim underlying it. Namely, that citizenship requires a bond of care. So, in order to be a good citizen and to engage in politics, we should care about what we're doing. And this is explained when, in a section later, Aristotle talks to us about friendship. So, in one of the sections, Aristotle tells us, the spirit of friendship is likely to exist to a lesser degree where women and children are in common. Friendship, we believe, is the chief good of cities, because it is the best safeguard against the danger of factional disputes. He then continues to discuss which specific kind of friendship he intends. There is a discussion on love. But what's important here to note is that our political nature is rooted not in, as we see in the contract theories we'll read later, but also modern theories modern economic theories trying to explain why we come together in societies, is not rooted into a rational calculation of interests, but rather in a civic bond of trust, friendship, and camaraderie. This idea is not completely uncommon to us, because it's also reflected in the writings of the social scientist or political scientist Robert Putnam. Some of you might actually have attended his lecture when he lectured at Maastricht University last year. And this notion which Putnam develops that is rather close to this idea of civic bonds in Aristotle would be his idea of social capital. So in order to have good politics, social capital is needed. We also find here a criticism, if you look closely enough, of our modern day societies. Because if politics occurs in a city which is based on civic bonds of friendship or trust, that state that fulfills, or the particular state that fulfills our philos as political beings, has to be a small state in which it's possible for these bonds to occur, rather than an empire, because an empire, Aristotle will claim, can only be ruled despotically, because it's too big to extend these relationships of trusts and these civic bonds amongst all members who constitute this empire. So we find here a criticism of cosmopolitan states or leagues of nations, if you want to. The last comment we'll make on citizenship is that it is dependent for Aristotle on the ability to engage into deliberative and judicial processes, yet to do this, you have to be a specific kind of person. So he excludes, for instance, children, foreigners, women, and slaves from his notion of citizenship. But even among the native male population of the city, he excludes people which are not affluent, because in his idea, you need to have enough free time to contemplate about these political questions and to be financially independent so that you cannot be bought when talking about your political opinion or influenced by the people who have money. So, to summarize what we've been doing up to this point, we said in order to understand how Aristotle evaluates his different kinds of constitutions, we have to know what his views on politics and the naturality of politics are. And in that, we discussed man as being a political being. We talked about how the city is natural, and we developed his notion of citizenship, which we can sum up as a citizen are people who are able to hold offices and engage into deliberative and judicial processes. That politics is characterized by civic bonds of friendship, and that his notion of citizenship is a rather restrictive one. So, this is basically what he talks about into the first two books that we've read. And in that, he describes how we can foster our philos as humans or human beings. But we haven't yet got an account of which regime is best tailored towards this fulfillment of this philos. Now let's turn to the question of regimes and constitutions. But before we do this, we should note that Aristotle splits up his discussion on regimes in two different components. So he talks about the compounds of the regime, which we for a large extent talked about. So the compounds of the regime are its citizens and its way of life, and then the constitution of a regime, which he calls the arrangements of offices in the state, or what we could refer to as an institutional setup. So since being a citizen, as we've discussed, is dependent on the ability of holding offices, and different constitutions will shape these offices differently and might have different offices available to them, each kind of constitution or regime will have a different kind of citizenry. And what is a good citizen or a just citizen is dependent upon this constitution. But only in the best constitution or in the just constitution, the good man and the good citizen are the same person or are equal. If you're interested in this discussion, I will refer you to chapter 4 in book 3. But let's finally get to the title of our task after almost 20 minutes, which is Aristotle and Constitutions. So let's start talking about these constitutions. We've already said that the constitution is the arrangement of offices in a state. So basically, a constitution is the answer to the oldest question in political philosophy, being the question, who should rule? And the answer to that is basically the one, the few, the many, or a mixture of these groups. Yet Aristotle also asks another question, a more normative question. And that question is being to the benefit of whom? And here we get also the answers, all, the many, the few, or the one. And in here he talks about that a well-structured society would rule for the benefit of all, where a corrupted or a ill-structured society rules for the benefit of a particular subsection. In his comparison of the different regimes, it might occasionally be tricky, although your version, the text version you've read, had made some cuts in it, which makes it a bit more to the point, to deduce which kind of regime Aristotle is the advocate for. So, as we mentioned in the beginning, his aim is to create better statesmen. And as we said, different regimes have different offices, and still to fulfill those best, there's different advice he gives to all of them. So he scrutinizes and praises some aspects of each type of regime, which might make it occasionally confusing to know which kind of regime Aristotle prefers. Yet, he presents an argument for what he calls the polity or politeia, which is a combination of an oligarchy and a democracy, and overcomes the factional problems which he identifies in both regimes. But let's unpack this argument for a bit. An oligarchy, he says, is not just defined by the quantity as ruled by the few, and a democracy is not just defined by its quantity, the many, but refers also to the rich and poor respectively. Which is interesting to note because what we find here is basically a first account of class struggle as driving force behind politics, around 2000 years before Karl Marx enters the scene. And I think this is, maybe as a Marxist, interesting to point out. Yet the biggest difference with Marx here is that the struggle or the class struggle is not characterized by Aristotle about the means of production, but rather about the honors of holding public office or status. So the class struggle, is essentially political rather than economic, as we will see in Marx. So let's see what the problems are with those two regimes that Aristotle wants to combine. An oligarchy and a democracy, Aristotle says, both make false claims about justice. So they both present a false claim with respect to equality, in which the oligarchs say because we're unequal in one regard, being affluence or wealth, we should be unequal in all respects. The Democrats, in a similar fashion, claim because we are born free and equal, we are equal, which is one respect, we are equal in all respects. For Aristotle, both of these conceptions are mistaken. And a political scientist or statesman here would have the role of bringing stability and harmony to a city and overcoming these factional disputes, which would either be the hubris of the oligarchs or the envy in the many when we are ruled by a democracy. If you're interested in which kind of practical wisdom or what that practical wisdom would look like, you can read the last chapters on education of this, but I also think that Isaiah Berlin, other political philosopher, has a text which very nicely illustrates that, and I've uploaded this to your Canvas environment, which is his essay on political judgment. It's rather short, so if you're interested, definitely worthwhile to read. So what would this stable mix between an oligarchy and a democracy look like? So a first glance at this is given in chapter 12 of book 4, from which I will quote, and the discussion will continue in book 5. Bear with me, as this is a rather lengthy quote, but again, since these quotes are a bit less easy to refer you to as the sections in Plato, I will post all the quotes in the comments below. So, start of the quote. What particular constitution is suited to what particular people? And what sort of constitution is suitable for what sort of population? Aristotle asks. Now, we must first grasp a general principle that holds for all constitutions. That the part of the city which wishes to continue must be stronger than the part of the city which does not. Quantity and quality both go into the making of every city, and by quality we refer to free birth, wealth, culture, and nobility of descent. By quantity we mean superiority in numbers. Quantity and quality must thus be placed into the balance against each other. Where the number of the poor exceeds the proportion just described, there will naturally be a democracy. Where the superiority of the rich and notables in point of quality is greater than their inferiority in quantity, there will naturally be an oligarchy. A legislator, a statesman, should always make the members of the middle class partners in the constitution. Where the middle class outweighs in numbers both the other classes, or even one of them, it is possible for a constitution to be permanent. A neutral arbiter always gives the best grounds for confidence, and the man in the middle is such arbiter. So what do we get here is essentially that the politeia is there to prevent factionalism and guarantees the continuation of the respective constitution. And remember that these constitutions in the city allow us to engage in politics, which is achieving our telos. So that's why this is important. So it avoids the hubris of the rich taking over and the envy of the poor ruling for their own benefit, where the benefit and the antagony of the other one is mostly aimed at increasing their own affluence rather than engaging in politics. So a strong middle class here will balance out these factional tendencies according to Aristotle and therefore engage into proper politics. If there are students of constitutions amongst you, this idea might sound familiar to you, as they are resonated or resonate in the American Constitution. Its emphasis on check and balances in the institutional setup of the US is designed indeed to avoid factionalist problems of a similar nature as well. What the American Constitution does with its emphasis on check and balances is kind of pit the ambitions of each of the different groups amongst each other for the benefit of all, so for the benefit of the nation in general. If you are interested in the resemblance between Aristotle's account of politeia, or his practical account of getting rid of factionalism, and the American Constitution, I would recommend that you have a look at the 10th Federalist paper, or as it's known as Federalist number 10, which is written by James Madison, which constitutes this discussion of the American Constitution and factionalism. I've not uploaded this paper to Canvas, but it should be widely available on the internet. Thus, the regime that avoids factionalism or political instability is what the politeia is, and it's Aristotle's preferred practical regime. A city ordered like this will give its citizens the best shot at fulfilling their telos. The statesman's aim is then to maintain the harmony in order to maintain the constitution of the city. And now the circle is round because it becomes evident that maintaining harmony in this sense requires a practical knowledge rather than a theoretical knowledge. So, thank you for bearing with me throughout this video. It is slightly lengthier than the previous one. I also hope that the bird in the background did not cause too much of annoyance while watching this, because currently, due to my radiator being broken, there's no other place to keep him. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. Enjoy your vacation, and I will see you next time to discuss Machiavelli. Thank you.